Okay, so would you rather have $10,000 transferred to your bank account daily or eat both of your hands?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I would rather eat both of my hands.
Would you rather be, I should have vetted these beforehand. Would you rather be uh, controlled by a mantis shrimp for a day and be forced to watch him make stupid shrimp decisions, or be the most wanted pirate on all of the seven seas for a month in the 1700s?
Oh, the latter for sure. I was actually talking to my wife about this while we were on vacation. I was like, man, it must have been so cool to just be like a 19, 20-year-old dude and just be like, I'm going to go jump on a ship and just go be a pirate. Like, how awesome.
The freedom? Yeah. Would you rather get $1 every time you compliment a stranger or $10 every time you insult a stranger in the meanest way possible?
Honestly,
You gotta tell us.
it would have to be the former because there's no way I can't just say mean things to people randomly. Like
Right?
that's just not in my DNA.
Would you? I think I know the answer to this next question because I just know you. But would you rather receive $5 million now or wait 10 years for 45 million?
Mm, 5 million now.
Right. Okay. I knew you were going to say that because you're going to do something with it to try to invest it to where in 5 years it's worth way more than 45. Am I right with that logic?
No, more of just like
Ah,
the marginal value that 5 million today would add would be more than 45 million would add 10 years from now. Because it's just like the way I live my life.
okay. All right. That's fair. And I have one more for you before we move on. Would you rather be left with a cliffhanger?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, people. Thank you for enduring that one with us. The real reason you're here is because you have an interest in the show and hopefully the show, or I should say the episode of the show today. And that is, we're going to be talking about healthy versus unhealthy foods. So thank you for tuning in. This is a great topic. I love this topic because I think that people have a very different opinion about this. And we're going to dive into a lot of the intricacies of this and what we mean when we talk about
Are
healthy
we?
and unhealthy foods. I think so. We're going to try. Can't make any promises.
Just checking.
Essentially, yeah, essentially, people think of when you think of healthy food, you probably think of like picture like a poster in your high school on the high school wall of the food pyramid, and that you see a lot of whole grain foods, a lot of whole foods, a lot of vegetables, fruits, things like that. That's typically what people think when they think of healthy foods. And unhealthy, you think of junk food, Oreos, ice cream. Although I don't want to bad talk ice cream because it's like one of my favorite foods ever, but we generally think of these things as junk food versus whole food. So what I really want to do with this episode is dive into the Macros Inc. philosophy and kind of what the approach that we take, the mindset that we try to teach people around that type of food, and just kind of get into why that maybe isn't the best way to think about it. And hopefully, with this, by the end of this episode, you guys will have a different concept of healthy versus unhealthy, and hopefully that leads to a little bit more food freedom for you, and maybe you don't end up being as restrictive. So, but I guess what do you think of when you think of healthy versus unhealthy foods? I mean, isn't that kind of the way you generally like when people say that we know what they mean, right? Like I assume that for you, like me when I was growing up, when you would hear those words, that's what I thought of. Is that what you also used to think of, like whole foods versus junk food when we talk about healthy versus unhealthy? Or did you have a different perception of that?
I mean, the colloquial way that we understand it is almost everybody has the same interpretation,
Correct.
right?
Yep.
It's fruits, vegetables, lean meats like chicken, fish, steak that's like not a ribeye, um,
We know what people
nuts,
mean when they say
nuts,
that.
seeds. Like most of us have the same kind of rough categorization schema in our head.
Yeah. Yep.
But the question is that actually accurate and correct? And is that the right frame? Is the real question. Not of how do people generally categorize them, but one, is that even the right question? And two, is that the right way to think about it?
There's something that I want to ask you, and we actually talked briefly on this a few episodes ago. I don't remember which one it was specifically, but it was around the topic of like how have we become a society that promotes unhealthy eating, and one of the things you said is, well, we have to take a look at how we got here, and you went back to like the 1900s and the industrial revolution and kind of started there. But when you look back at our I'll say great grandparents, well, probably grandparents, but certainly great grandparents, that era, they didn't really have, I mean, they had nowhere near the types of foods that we did. So this term of healthy and unhealthy has evolved, right? Can we, like, I guess then this is just more of my curiosity is I would like to hear from you, and maybe for people that didn't watch that episode, walk us through that description that you gave about how did we get here to the point where we are having this discussion of healthy versus unhealthy, and kind of how our food system has changed over the last century, because it didn't used to be like this, right? The conversations that we're having around food, they never would have taken place 100 years ago. It just wasn't the same. So I'm kind of curious to hear again how you explain how we got here.
So I'll go through that exercise, but then I also think it's really important to come back to the label of healthy food, and I think really unpack that. I mean, so if you just look at food as part of human life over the course of human evolution, for 90 plus, 95 plus, 98 plus, I'd have to go do the math, % of our existence as humans, we suffered from not enough energy and in some situations, not enough nutrients. So there used to be very high rates of starvation and very high rates of illnesses that arise from not having sufficient vitamins, minerals, etc. Right? Things like rickets were fairly common, scurvy, beriberi, these things that came about from just not having enough nutrients. As we went from rural to urban, urban to industrialization, industrialization to modernization, we basically created the ability to produce energy in terms of calories very efficiently and very cheap, and to produce nutrients very efficiently and very cheap. So if you actually look at the rates of starvation, especially in modern developed countries, it's almost zero. It's not zero, but it's approaching zero. And the rates of like true nutrient deficiencies that actually cause health problems, not like, hey, you're suboptimal, is also like rapidly approaching zero, right? There's a lot of people who have vitamin D deficiencies, magnesium deficiencies, but to the point where they cause like real clinical disease is almost zero. Now, the flip side of that is what it took to get there changed the way we produce, acquire, consume, and think about food. We used to produce our own food. We used to produce quote unquote natural food. And now we primarily pay for our food, have it delivered to us, and it's generally a more processed form of the food. And we'll talk about processing it a little bit, but like that's a big shift. And we used to consume 80 to 90% of the food at home, and now we consume like 20 to 30% of our food at home. Like these are just big shifts in how we consume food. So that's a little bit of what's happened. But
that's
I think
crazy to me, by the way, 80%, and it's down to like 30%. You said now?
Yeah, I'd have to go look at the data, but it's like we consume
that's a big shift.
Far more food outside the house, whether that's eating out at restaurants, picking up to-go food, having Uber Eats delivered, etc.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Now, I think the next place to take the conversation about healthy versus unhealthy foods is to realize that term is actually entirely subjective. And it's subjective on like two different axes. One is, how do you define health? right? There's still not a agreed upon universal definition, right? In some circles, health is merely the absence of disease, in which case trying to consume food that either moves you further from a disease state or prevents you from going to a disease state is considered healthy. There's other definitions of healthy that is like having additional capacity above baseline. So foods would only be considered healthy if they improve that status. So it really comes down on that axis of how you define health. The other piece is food can be described as healthy or unhealthy entirely contextually based on who you are and the situation
Correct.
you're in.
Yep.
There's a situation where someone eating a McDonald's Big Mac fries and a milkshake is healthier for them than eating a salad. And there's some people where eating the Big Mac fries and a milkshake is less healthy than eating a salad. So it's all contextual. So labeling a food without having any understanding of context kind of misses the mark. Now, fortunately, the average person represents most people. So even when we label foods as healthy or unhealthy, it generally applies to most people. But it's still not the most accurate way to talk about food.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
That's a great Billy Madison quote. Everyone
I'm so sorry.
is now dumber for having listened to you.
Actually, Brad was spot on. I just like to get him with these little, snippets. So don't mind. He's actually pretty spot on about that. I wrote about this in the group earlier too, and I do like what you said about, because the way I put it was the example I gave, and it's an extreme example, but if you think of take broccoli, we think of broccoli as a healthy food, right? But if all I eat is broccoli, I'll become sick and could potentially die from malnourishment. Right? So then suddenly in that case,
or depression.
Well, or yes. Yes. But suddenly broccoli doesn't seem so healthy, right? So it's within the context of your behaviors and the habits and the situation that you find yourself in. So yeah, so that was spot on, and I think you really nailed it. It's interesting to me just how we, like I said, how we got here, and I'm really actually curious to see what the updated stats would be, as far as, because we've also made it think about how abundantly, how easy is it now to get food. It's never been easier. You can literally have restaurant food delivered to your house. So I would think that our caloric expenditure has actually increased more than it ever has. Do you know the stats on what is the average American? I shouldn't, not even just the average American, but let's just say that Western society. Are those rates of our calorie consumption rates going up, just on average? And maybe not just for Western society, I guess globally it would vary on location, but you get what I'm saying. Our rates, is calorie consumption increasing?
Yeah. So, what's really interesting about this is I have spent probably more time than there's probably maybe 20, 30 people on the planet who spent more time searching for that data than me. I have spent an inordinate amount of time to look at average calorie consumption per capita, over time. There is some data on it. How accurate it is, I'm not 100% convinced of. But from what I can tell, it looks like we're consuming on average roughly 200 to 300 calories per day more now. Roughly, I mean, I think it actually probably peaked in the late 90s to early mid 2010, and it's probably slowly coming down a little bit, maybe stabilizing. But what's more interesting is the physical activity data. Is the amount of total physical activity we get in a day has dropped a lot, probably 300 to 500 calories a day. And what's really interesting is if you take that rough calorie delta of, and it really depends on the data you look at, but let's just say it's on average 400 to 600 calories a day is the change in intake and net. It almost perfectly explains the increase in the average weight of a US American over that time frame. Like almost
Okay.
perfectly. Not completely perfectly, but like it's pretty close. Which is really interesting that the observational epidemiological data matches what we see in the average weight. Like if I look this up, like the average weight of an American in like the 1950s was something like 62 kilos. That was women. I gotta look this up. Let's see, like what's 62 times 2.2? Yeah. So I think it was like women like average like 130, 135 pounds, and men were like 150 and 155 pounds. And I think it's now like 155, 160 to like 185, 190. Like there's been a big shift.
This is global average?
American data, US data.
Okay. Oh, maybe
There's
so
not
then I
there's
missed it.
not
Okay.
great there's not great data for worldwide just because of how much countries went through the development process. Like Mexico changed
Sure, yep.
dramatically during the 1990s. India has changed dramatically since the 1990s. So it's been a lot different.
I think actually not to pick on Mexico, but I think they are actually. I recently heard that they were maybe on par with obesity rates with the United States now, or maybe even exceeded. I'm not sure, but yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that because I'm sure there have got to be countries that are way up there and then countries that are like way down here. So there's probably a big discrepancy depending on where you look. The average, you know how it says that caloric values on certain labels are based on the average 2,000 calorie. Do we know where that? This is just a random thought, but do we know what was that based on? Did they base that on because that used to be the average caloric consumption of the average person, or is that just because it's easy to set values based on a simple number like that?
I don't have a very clear answer on that.
Yeah, I was just curious. I don't know. I've always wondered where that number came from and why 2,000. Because I look at those, I'm like, there's no way. I mean, most people consume more than 2,000 calories.
My guess is they probably did the like calculation of the average BMR plus the average physical activity and like imputed based on a spectrum of people and said this is roughly the average. That would be my guess. I don't know exactly how they did that because I haven't ever really looked it up, to be honest.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So another interesting thing that I kind of want to talk about, get your take on. We eat for pleasure a lot, right? Like
Mhm.
we've evolved to not, like, it used to be that you would eat because you needed to survive. And now it's like it's like a hobby for some people. And I think that also influences the way, I mean, we go back to talking about habits, and if you I think you said you wanted to dive into this a little bit more, or maybe it was something else you mentioned you want to dive into. But I'm talking about people's, your habits defining, having an influence over whether a food is healthy or unhealthy. We've sort of shifted more toward this unhealthy area because of the way that we eat and the reasons that we eat. Like if I'm watching a football game, there's usually food at the the counter or the end table next to the couch or whatever, right? And it's just sort of this thing that we're watching a movie, we eat. So it's like food is everywhere, and we've kind of gotten to the point where we just eat for pleasure, right? Um, how does that play into all this?
If you look at why we eat, there's the physiological reason of we need calories to have energy to survive. And then there is the reward circuitry in our brain that says, hey, we have to eat. If I have to eat, I should probably try to eat foods that give me the most bang for my buck in terms of survival likelihood. So foods that generally are higher in energy density, so like they have more calories, they taste better. We're wired to consume more of those foods. Like that's just how we've evolved. what's interesting is we've also evolved to not enjoy foods that, historically speaking, are not good for us, right? Like some of the, I don't want to say poisons, but like the natural compounds in foods that are not good for us generally taste bitter. So we don't enjoy
Yeah,
that,
sure.
right?
Mhm.
But what's interesting is we have effectively taken out the physiological need to eat. The average person could go weeks without eating and be fine.
Mhm.
So that means most of the food that we consume now has to do with habit, culture, reward, and the inability to be comfortable with having some level of hunger, right? And what's interesting is the foods that generally tend to drive the highest amount of reward and that we want to consume and that we build habits around eating are generally what we would label the less healthy foods, right? If we kind of take the colloquial definition and we say, hey, highly processed foods, lots of energy density, lots of salt, lots of sugar, lots of fat, lots of crunch, those generally tend to be the unhealthy foods, but those drive the highest reward. And so that's part of the other reason why we generally tend to just classify foods as one or the other. Now, I think the important distinction there is it actually has less to do with whether a food is healthy or unhealthy. And when you make food choices, is that food choice developing a pattern of behavior that's more aligned with your goals or less aligned with your goals? So if your goal is to lose weight, you want to try to eat a diet that is high in satiety, low in energy density, contains sufficient amounts of protein, has enough vitamins, minerals, etc., and doesn't create a super high food reward in your brain. So when you eat that food, you don't get like, oh my God, I want to eat more of that food just because it tastes so good. Like when you eat an apple tastes pretty good, but you're not going to be like, I want 7 apples.
Right.
When you eat a handful of Doritos, all you want is another handful of Doritos. So when we talk about kind of foods on the other side of the spectrum, I mean, when you consume a diet that has, foods that are more palatable, higher in energy density, they've kind of been engineered to make you overconsume. You're actually just making food choices that the sum of the qualities of that food are actually just pushing you further away from your goals. And so when I talk to clients about like, hey, let's think about categorizing food, I think about it is, are the food choices I'm making pushing me more towards my goals or away from my goals? And that means that as long as you're making the decisions of I'm eating food that's pushing me towards my goals 80% of the time, the other 20 is probably not creating such a habit that it's meaningfully deterring you from reaching your goals.
I think there's also, this just shows that there is merit to the 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 typical bro diet, let's call it, where when you think of like bodybuilders who, or they're prepping for a show or something and all they're eating is chicken and rice and broccoli all the time, like that sounds miserable, but there's some merit to why they're doing that. They're trying to maximize satiety, they're trying to get the right nutrients in, they're trying to do everything that you kind of just mentioned, and they're trying to stay away from the foods that are not really going to get them to their goals, or trying to stay away from some of those temptations. So as miserable as that sounds, it works because, I mean, how are you going to overconsume chicken breasts? Plain chicken breast tastes terrible. Like it's like, yeah, like you're not going to overeat. There's nobody that's gaining weight eating just chicken breasts. Like it's not happening. So there is some merit to that. So for people real quick, just that are tuning in now, because we have some new viewers, we're talking about unhealthy versus healthy foods, and we're doing this within the context of the idea that there's really there's no such, we shouldn't look at foods as healthy or unhealthy. Foods are kind of just neutral. They are what they are, and it's our behaviors around them that determine whether eating more of that food would be a healthy or unhealthy thing to do. And it's sort of a different way to look at things. We also suggest the 80-20 rule, right? Where you 80% of the time try to eat foods that you would consider, the picturesque healthy, 20% discretionary calories, or in Brad's case, just the 20% is just ice cream to the ice cream place that he goes to down the street. But essentially, eat whatever you want for the remaining 20%, because it's your habits that determine whether it's healthy or unhealthy. Not that I'm trying to split hairs here, but I think nomenclature matters. What would you rather? What words do you think we should use instead of, if we had to say we're going to ditch healthy versus unhealthy foods? What words would you use? I guess I would use foods that are nutrient dense, and some are very low in nutrients. But is there a more
Yeah, I
succinct
mean,
way to say that?
I would even say, I think there's two things I'd say. One, I would more categorize them as, are these foods pushing me towards my goal or away from my goal? That is this food choice I'm about to make in the context of putting me closer to my goal or further away from my goal, right? And then within that framework, it's okay, I consider the overall calories, the overall nutrients. Do the ingredients in this food like push my health profile towards what I'm looking for or away from it? And so I think it's more of that. That's the mindset that I think is better than healthy versus unhealthy, because then that still gives you the ability to kind of catalog foods in your brain and make like easy user decisions, but then also gives you like the flexibility, right? A donut, a maple bar, or as I just learned, I think like Keisha called them Long Johns or something. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, Long Johns.
Yeah. That's not what they're called. Anyway.
You've never heard? Oh, that's what they're called. But
continue. So, like with that frame of reference, even if you are trying to lose weight, a maple bar / Long John on a Sunday with your kids, when the rest of your day is going to look like lean protein, fruits, vegetables, etc., would still fall within the category of that would be pushing you closer towards your goals. Now, if Friday you went out to the bar and you had 6 beers and 24 wings, Saturday you were at a tailgate watching college football and you ate 5,500 calories of barbecue, and then Sunday morning you had the maple bar, in that context, it actually would be pushing you further away from your goal, right? So in that context, that donut is quote unquote not healthy, if we're going to label it. So I think that's the first thing, is putting them into that those two categories. The second thing is this 80-20 rule, I think, is less about 80-20 and more about what does it represent? It represents the majority of the time you're making decisions that push you closer towards your goal. And occasionally you can make decisions that move you away from your goal. It's sort of like, put this in the financial terms. You spend all your time saving all your money so you can retire, but it's okay every once in a while to spend some money to go on the vacation with your family because you might die before you even retire, right? Like there's some discretionary level of not every single thing has to be 100% towards your goal, and you're still going to make roughly the same progress. Like if you retire with $3.9 million versus $4.1 million, there's no difference, right? It's if at the end of your diet you weigh 145.6 or 145.3, like no one cares. It doesn't look any different.
That's true. I do want to say though, what if my goal is to have fun? Because then your scenario of Friday night, 6 beers and wings, and then Saturday tailgating, having 5,500 calories of barbecue, and then a maple donut the next day, that sounds a lot more fun. That's pushing me to my goals. That sounds like a lot of fun.
If you have adopted the philosophy of hedonism and it's just like fun is the only metric by which you make decisions, then you're right. But I think most people who want to live a life that actually has any sort of value and meaning have realized the actual goal of life is not just fun all the time.
Was there ever a time in your life where you just ate like pure crap? Like your diet was just horrible and you look back on it, you're like, damn, I ate like horrible, and it's just,
Dude, I was
how
a
did I ever get through
13-year-old
that?
at one point.
So just basically your childhood. Like you never had like a moment in your adulthood where you were like, damn, I need to clean up my diet. This sucks.
No. I think it's here's a hot take. I've looked at enough food logs that I think the average adult knows and understands what is, quote, a good food choice and what is, quote, a bad food choice.
I would
And
agree with that.
the problem we have is not that like most people are not subsisting on fast food, takeout,
Correct.
beer all the
Yep.
time. Like that's just not what I've seen. Now, are there subsets of people that live that way? Yes, but that I would say is the rare exception. What the difficulty is, I think, for people is they take these broad ideas of like, oh, I'm eating mostly healthy foods, but don't actually understand what that looks like in their daily life and have a very skewed understanding of the actual quantification of their behavior. Like I can eat 5,000 calories of healthy food and I'm still going to gain weight. I can eat 1,200 calories of unhealthy food and I can lose weight. So they just have this disconnect between what I think I'm eating and
Correct.
what my body's actually utilizing. And there's just this mismatch that occurs for so long.
Well, I also think that there's a lot of, there's what you said was in my experience very valid, but I also think that, so when I talk to a lot of people about wanting to, work with a coach, obviously they're interested in coming on board with us. One of the common things that I hear is they feel like they need to clean up their diet a lot. But I think what's actually more common is most people eat better than they give themselves credit for. And what I mean by that is when you actually start to review people's food logs, they eat a decent variety of foods. Like, in other words, it's not like most people need a drastic revision of their diet. What is the problem more often than not is that they're just eating too much. It's not that their diet requires like, hey, you're eating, way too much of this item here, get rid of that and eat this instead. It's not so much that. It's actually, your diet, you eat a pretty decent variety of foods, and it looks like kind of week by week you pretty much eat the same things, but it's just you're eating too much. Has that been your experience as well? That I think people just feel like they have this conception that my diet needs a drastic overhaul, and in reality it usually doesn't. It might need some tweaks here and there, but like we just need to get you to eat less overall, rather than like wiping the slate clean and starting over.
Yeah, and it's also more of how do you make it a priority and continue to make decisions that are congruent with your goals despite all the stuff that life is throwing at you.
Yeah.
I think that's a much bigger issue.
This is a good time for someone to just put a comment, not in here, but on Facebook. And this is in regard to the post that I made earlier about the healthy versus unhealthy foods example, where I talked about, broccoli being unhealthy if all I eat is broccoli. And one of the things I said was, I suggested that the words people use would be, or the way to look at food would be, some foods are nutrient dense, some are devoid of nutrients, etc. One of the comments that somebody said was, everyone says everything in moderation, but no one explains what moderation is. I thought that was kind of an interesting point. How would you define that? Do you want to tackle that one? Because I like her comment. I know where she's coming from, and I think it's valid.
I think moderation.
I think moderation is subjective.
Yeah, I think moderation is a lazy concept. Like, what does that mean? I don't think it means anything. I think it's a cop-out for, you don't really have to be that strict. nothing really matters. Just kind of do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Moderation is different to everybody. And I think what it really means is you have to have some level of consistency to make any progress, but it's not 100% or die.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that's really what moderation means. And I think that looks different for everybody. I think for some people, moderation means they are very strict to the program they're doing for 2 weeks and then they have a day off. I think for some people, it's I eat 80% of my calories in a given day under this dietary framework, and 20% of the calories are a little more free and flexible. I think it's totally different. So I think just this concept of moderation is just, it's a lazy way of actually helping people solve their individual problems. Like if I have 100 clients and I say, hey, follow this plan and just eat in moderation, what does that actually tell
It's
them?
going to look 100
Like,
different
what does
ways.
that mean? So I think what it really is, okay, for a client, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? For this client, it means, hey, you have super good control over your breakfast because you make it at home after the gym. You guys eat at home as a family 5 nights a week. Your lunches 3 days a week are like rigid because you can pack your lunch, but you have to go out to lunch with the office 2 days a week. And then your kids are in sports on Saturday, Sunday. So like lunch is just always a free for all. So with that client, I'm going to say, hey, for you, moderation looks like on your lunch out on Wednesdays at work and the lunch that you get out with your family on Saturday, like feel free to make those 700-800 calorie, like real meals out with your family where you don't really worry too much about it. Like for that client, that's moderation. That is a much more useful way to think about moderation for somebody other than, hey, just eat in moderation. It's like, well, does that mean one piece of pie every day? Does that like, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah. I just thought of something too, that this is something that comes up in our industry as well. And especially as it relates to the philosophy of IIFYM, which for anyone that doesn't know, that means if it fits your macros. So there's this concept that has sort of come from that idea that, hey, you can eat whatever you want as long as it fits your macros and you can still lose weight, because if it fits your macros, it means you're within your calories and therefore you're going to lose weight. So, hey, let me just take this to the extreme end of this and say, I can eat nothing but shit food my entire diet and I'm still going to lose weight and it's all good, right? That is not the approach that we take. And so on one end of the extreme, where we talk, like some people might only eat quote unquote healthy foods, we're also not saying that, hey, just because you can eat 1,200 calories of junk food like you mentioned earlier and still lose weight, well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea to just eat 1,200 calories of junk food because, hey, I'm going to lose weight. Although it is interesting. Go ahead.
I mean, I think there's 2 problems with that. One is there's this false narrative buried in there that the ingredients in the food you consume don't matter at all. And that's not true, right? We know that, we know that carrying a healthy body weight is one of the most important things you can do for reducing overall chronic disease risk. However, like if you eat a diet that is, super high in like highly processed oils, cooked charred meat, like all of it, super high in sodium. Like there's some of these things that we do know carry some small additional risk. And so just to say that the food ingredients don't matter in the long run, I don't think is true. Now, it is true that you can eat a very low quality diet, and if you lose weight, your overall risk goes down. That is true. But the bigger problem is, what habits are you instilling and how long do those habits last? Like how long can you consume just McDonald's every day and maintain a healthy body weight before you just start to consume more calories than you did? And I think about it in terms of like, here's an analogy I was talking to with a client a few years ago, and I was just thinking about this. Let's say you are a 22-year-old right out of college, you have a decent job making 70 to 100 grand a year. You split rent $800 with your friends. You have no car payment. Like your insurance is $200 a month. And so you have like $5,000 to $6,000 a month of like relatively disposable income. You just kind of spend whatever you want. You don't track your budget. You don't really have any financial habits. Like that's totally fine. You could do that for forever and it's probably going to be okay. Okay. Well, now you get married. Now you buy a house. Now you have, in Dylan's case, 27 children. Okay. Well, now you have a house payment. Now your life is very busy. Now you have insurance for all these kids. And so those habits you developed early are now going to be a disaster for trying to manage the financials of a family. The same thing is like you can kind of eat whatever food quality you want when you are like super diligent tracking your food and yada, yada, yada. But as life gets busy and you have to rely more on habits and choices, are those habits going to be sustainable long term? I think it's really hard.
Do you remember that example of I think it was a Kansas State University professor, the gas station diet, and he improved, I think
there's been so many of those. Like there's a guy who did the ice cream diet, the potato diet, the Super Size Me guy gained a lot of weight.
That's
Jordan Syatt last year, maybe the year before, maybe this year, I can't remember. He basically ate a Big Mac every day for 30 days and lost weight. Energy balance is real. Like anybody who says it's not is out to lunch. Right. But the importance is, what are the habits you're building as you're making those choices? And so I think that's something that can't be overlooked. I think I'm trying to remember because this was a really good quote I had, and I'm trying to not butcher it. If you are diligently tracking your food, the overall quality of the food is not super important for weight loss. If you are not tracking your food, the overall quality of your food really matters for weight loss.
I caught zero logic in all that.
No, I got it though. Was that was a Bradism? Was that a you quote?
Yes, I'll have to go back and look through it, like find the exact quote, but yes.
I had a thought on that. Now it fled me. We did get some comments, by the way.
Oh yeah, Derek has a question in here too.
I am not wearing astronaut pants. He wanted to know if I was wearing astronaut pants. The answer is no. I'm not going to space today. He has a question for you though. Genuine question. Do you think that you're an outlier on that aspect, Brad? No shade, for real, for real. I'm not sure what he's referring to though. That was at the 232 mark.
I think that was when you asked
about
if
the food
I ever like really struggled with the overall.
Yeah.
I probably am an outlier in that. I mean, I would say I'm not that different from the average person, and that for the majority of my life, I ate a relatively balanced diet, but didn't really pay that close of attention. Like, and I grew up in a household that, I mean, we had average meals. Like there was pasta, there was bread, there was processed food every once in a while, there was dessert occasionally. I ate cereal for breakfast. Like kind of grew up on the standard American diet, but we just didn't have like tons of fast food or eat out a lot. Mine never went like all the way to the extreme of all I ever did was eat fast food and drink a ton of pop.
There's a couple of things that.
Yeah, I think to your point earlier, I think a lot of people have this idea of like, because Derek's question in here is cleaning up your diet. I think it's less of that. And I think it's more of making it a priority and making conscious decisions that the food you consume aligns with your goals. I think most of us just go through life just eating food. Like we don't think about it. Is this align with my goals? Is this not? How many calories is this? So I think like my process of cleaning up my diet, I mean, there was obviously periods where I was pretty strict about food quality, but it was more of a making it a big priority in my life of, oh, I'm making conscious choices about the food I eat. And I think that's really more of what people expect this. I need to just change all the foods I'm eating. And it's more of like, no, is this decision I'm making aligning with what I'm doing?
There are a couple of things that I want to sort of round out this episode with, because we got about 13 to 14 minutes left. But we want our clients to be successful, obviously. We want people that are in our group that are discovering this, this lifestyle to be successful. And one of the things that we say is make sure that that you incorporate your favorite foods, because it makes it more sustainable for most people, right? Like if I suddenly learn that I can diet and lose weight and still have a glass of wine at night, or have the ice cream that's in the fridge, like I can still eat those things and lose weight. That sounds amazing to a lot of people. But then on the other side of that, there are people who would do better adhering to what I referred to earlier as the bro diet, because, and we've talked about this before, because there are people who, if they get a taste of something, or they're on a diet and they go and eat their ice cream that they usually like, now all hell breaks loose and they lose control, and they literally have to abstain, right? So this goes back to what does healthy and unhealthy mean to someone like that? What do healthy and unhealthy behaviors mean to someone like that? So I think it's important to just remember that you may be someone who can incorporate those types of foods into your diet and do well, and you might be someone that just has to leave it, like you can't even bring it into your house. And I'm sure you've worked with people like that on both sides.
Yeah, and I think it's about knowing yourself, and it kind of comes back to that quote I had
Yes.
earlier of, I think everything in moderation is a lazy concept.
Yeah,
It's
it's a blanket concept.
What utility does that idea provide other than it's basically just a way of saying you don't have to be perfect. Okay, that's great. What value is that adding to like actual coaching? Like if your coach says eat anything in moderation, it's not coaching.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other concept that I wanted to What'd you say? You cut out.
That's just a platitude.
Oh, yeah. Yes. The kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about was,
Is this actually the last thing, or is this a false last thing?
I mean, I think it's kind of the last thing. I don't really have anything else in mind unless you had something. We get people, and we just had our Black Friday sale, right? Hey, by the way, anybody watching that, if you're interested, we might still be able to sneak you in. Let me know. Shoot me an email, dylan@macrosinc.net. We might still have a few spots for you. Just saying. We're always going to have coaching spots for you. Don't worry. But so we get these people that say, I want to work with you guys. I want to sign up. I want to get a coach. I want to be your client. We had this over the weekend. People wanted to jump into the sale, but they were concerned with, I just don't want to weigh everything. Like, I don't want to weigh and track everything. Like, I'm concerned about that. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't also include the idea of tracking into the conversation of healthy versus unhealthy behaviors. Because much like abstaining, that we just talked about, there are people that if they track their food and they obsess over all these calories, if they obsess over everything, if they obsess over every single thing that they, every gram that they weigh, that's actually not a healthy thing for them. And it could, exacerbate certain behaviors, and maybe it leads them to go, binge eat on the weekends because they had an entire week of, they were so strict that I just can't take it anymore, and I'm going to go off the rails on the weekend, or whatever it might be. So I thought it was worth mentioning that there's a lot of merit to just trying to help people understand portion sizes. It goes back to the eating sensibly thing we talked about, like what does that mean? Like there are other ways to lose weight, to diet without having to worry about every morsel of food if that's not an unhealthy thing for you to do. So I just thought it was, I thought that was worth mentioning. There's a reason why there's a million different diets out there. It's not just, counting macros. There's a bunch of different ways to do this and to achieve your goals. I don't know if it's me or I think you might be muted.
I think the best way to look at this is to actually think about it from this perspective. What we're trying to do with all of our clients fundamentally is two things. One is build nutritional literacy, and two is help people improve habits through better decision making. Like that's fundamentally what we're doing. And so the component of nutritional literacy is I'm just trying to get you to develop a better understanding of the food you're consuming, right? It's sort of like financial literacy. Do you understand your income? Do you understand what you're spending money on? Do you understand interest rates? Do you understand investing? Like, what are these things? And so when we think about it from the food perspective is there's a lot of ways to build nutritional literacy. Understanding the nutrients in food is obviously a big one. Understanding how different foods affect like how many calories you consume, how frequently you eat, things like that, satiety, etc. The tracking your food, like putting it in an app, helps you develop an intuition and a understanding around how your decisions actually influence how many calories you're consuming. Things like weighing and measuring your food helps you really understand the difference between what you visually see and what is actually in there. And so there's like these layers to this stuff. And weighing and measuring is one layer, and it's one set of a financial tool, right? Some people weigh and measure their food for years because for them, it's just part of the process.
Correct.
Right? It's like if you're baking a cake, professional bakers weigh everything they put in. Like ask Carly, right? She was a professional baker. Like even after years when you've like eyeballed your cake a million times, you're still going to weigh it because the accuracy is important. And so it's just another tool. It's another layer in that kind of fine nutritional literacy toolbox. And so that's what I think the perspective is weighing and measuring is less about like being neurotic about your food. And it's more about how do I develop an understanding of what and how much am I actually consuming?
Yeah. And it's that point that to where you can get to the point of being able to answer that question yourself and fly solo that we try to get people to. What I mean by that is you mentioned nutritional literacy and building better habits. I won't sugarcoat it. Anybody that's listening and anybody that has done this before knows that after you've lost weight, it will be something you're going to have to consciously work at for the rest of your life. Like it'll be something that you have to just be cognizant of. I'm not saying that means you're going to have to weigh your food forever, but you're always going to have to be mindful of portions. You're always going to have to be mindful of how much you eat. Like it'll always be something that you pretty much have to work at, right? Or at least be aware of.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was pretty much finished with my point. Go ahead.
I mean, it's sort of like everybody's going to have some track of the money they spend unless they're a billionaire.
Mm-hmm. Like you need some bumpers.
Yeah. I mean, unless you have won the genetic lottery, you are going to have some level of intentionality around the food you consume and assess what you're doing, whether that's tracking, whatever, like for your whole life.
Yep.
Unless like, it's just like financially, like even if you're retired, you can't go spend $500,000 a month. You can't go eat 500,000 calories a month and expect to not gain weight. Like there is some level of, you have to have lifetime intentionality about what you're doing.
Speaking of eating 500,000 calories, I wonder how much calories the average person consumes in their lifetime. We could do the math. I mean, if you have a 2,000, let's just say 2,000. What's the average age? 75, we'll say.
I think
30, maybe it's
80
older.
is the average
70,
death age.
80?
58,400,000 is what I have.
Yeah, that's what I'm. Have you ever seen that graphic about how many calories are in a gram of
Uranium.
Yes, uranium. It was like 1 billion calories or something.
Yeah.
Are
Dude, how
there
awesome
any-
would it be if you could just eat like 1 gram of uranium and then never have to eat again in your whole life? You would save so much time and so much money.
So can we talk about real
Cool.
quick? Let's. I know I said I already had the last thing I wanted to talk about, but you just gave me an idea.
See, I told you that
Superman.
was not actually the last
Okay.
thing.
Does Superman need to eat food because he gets his energy from the sun? So I assume that Superman also he yeah, does he need to eat? Does he need to consume calories?
Okay. I have actually thought about this before. So not directly related to Superman, but I had this idea a long time ago. What if we just engineered humans to have chlorophyll in our skin so we could be like plants and be autotrophs? Well, it turns out there's not enough surface area on the human body to get enough energy from, even if we have perfect efficiency from the photons in the sun, there's not enough energy for us to provide enough like energy for our bodies.
Energy, sure.
Okay. So that's the average person. Now let's assume Superman expends way more energy than the average person because he's doing way more stuff and he's flying and his body's way more dense than us, like, right? And he's probably shooting laser beams out of his eyes, which take a huge amount of energy. The only way that it would be possible is if the photons from the sun, the Krypton sun or whatever it's called, have a much higher energy density than the average photon, which I don't think is physically possible. So I'm going to assume it's not physically possible.
Yeah, that's probably a fair assumption. That's as good an assumption as any.
This is sort of like the argument that I had with Corey. If anybody wants an insight into what it's like to work at Macros Inc., Corey and I had a meeting one time and we were talking about zombies. And
oh my God.
We looked up the paper that looked at the like calculation of humans and how they convert to zombies. And then I actually did the calculation when we were on the meeting of how many calories a zombie would require to survive and how much like available humans and edible wildlife for zombies there are. And I think the math ended up being like, you only have to survive for like 36 months before all of the zombies are not just like dead because they're undead, but like they don't have enough energy to sustain the population based on their metabolic rate. So you just have to survive for 36 months.
That's good to know. I'm glad I know the math.
I'm just saying. Now my math could have been way off, but that was the conclusion I came to.
Well, so before we wrap this up, what you're saying about skin and surface area, we don't have enough. So could we engineer humans to then like basically you like hook yourself up to some solar panels and then we'd have enough energy to sustain?
I mean, you'd have to rewire your entire metabolism. So I don't think that's possible.
Just saying.
But like that's why plants have leaves. Like they need more surface area. That's why plants are like fractal.
Oh yeah. That's interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're out of time. I'll save the additional thoughts, but I love nerding out like that. We did get a couple comments, too, that Sonia says, thank you. I'm glad I found this community. And Natalie said, appreciate your time. Always feel fed from your conversations. Thank you. She's probably not talking about the irrelevant conversations, though. Probably only the relevant ones. So, hey, I hope you guys all liked this episode. I really don't have anything else, but I do want to say thank you for tuning in. And we'll be back next week, so I hope you can tune in. We always do these at 2 p.m. Central Time every Tuesday. So, Brad, unless you got anything, I think we can sign off. Was there any final thing you wanted to say?
If anybody has topic ideas, let us know.
Yeah. Actually, you can put them in the group, the Facebook group. If you guys, if you want to see us talk about any sort of topic on the Facebook or on the Macros Inc. live show, put it in there. We're open to suggestions. So, all right. That's it. That's all I got. I'm outie. Are you outie?
As the kids say, that's all, folks.
As Looney Tunes would say, that's all.
Exactly.
All right, we're out of here. Adios, guys. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.